Thank you so very much, Rob, for the invitation. It's a blessing. And Judy, thank you again for setting everything up. It's really been a joy to be here. We got here a couple nights ago, came in on a snowstorm. That was nice, and spoke to several groups in the meantime. We will get to that other talk, but I want to present some research. If I were to ask you a question, how many of you guys are pretty creation savvy here, as opposed to the average person? Look at all those hands. So we have a creation savvy people. Good. That'll come back to haunt you later for admitting to that. So let's get some research. Let's talk about some things. A gentleman spoke to me before, said the book that the founder of the ministry I work for, ICR, wrote, called The Genesis Flood, really changed his life. Why did it change his life? Because it overturned the standard view of how geology happened, which was the uniformitarian view, and it replaced it with a better explanation, better scientifically and better biblically, that tied together a lot of dots. And that was that the geology we see around us and these mountains and everything else happened because of a worldwide flood, just as described in the Bible. Now we want to do the same thing with biology, because all of us have been evolutionized in one sense or another. We've let evolutionary thinking, and I know, even if you're creation savvy, it comes into our mind and it captures the way we think. And so we want to overturn the standard explanation of adaptation with one that is better scientifically and better biblically. So I did a talk yesterday for the Denver Creation Society, and it laid the background for a new model of explaining adaptation called continuous environmental tracking. And I know some of you are here today, so I'm not going to replow all that ground. But let me give you a couple minute synopsis. Let's take the Bible at face value and believe all the words that it says. So when the Bible says when God created the earth, there was evening and morning. When you have evening and morning cycles, does that mean there's a static earth or a dynamic earth? It's a dynamic earth. When he says that he gave the moon and the stars and stuff to mark signs and seasons, I don't have to ask that too much for people in Colorado, but are seasons static or dynamic? They're dynamic. And when he told creatures to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, when you have your space and someone comes in and they fill your space, have I changed your space for you? For the better, of course. It is. For the better on that. But for some of you, you take resources out of my space and you leave things behind in my space and you change it. So Earth, from the very beginning, was a dynamic place. A dynamic place. Can you put static organisms on a dynamic planet?
No.
No. You must have what kind of organisms? Dynamic organisms, which means from the very moment of creation, these organisms had to be adaptable. They had to be adaptable. So they always were adaptable. Now, why is adaptability important? Well, from a general revelation standpoint, it takes a lot more engineering genius and prowess to make something that is automated, autonomous, and fully adaptable than it does to make a chair or a table. And if the Lord is revealing His glory and His genius and His wisdom, you do that through highly adaptable, autonomous things. Because I can tell you, as an engineer, before I ever went to med school, it is a great challenge to build autonomous, adaptable things. And the ones that the Lord built make man-made things look very, very simplistic in comparison. So He's revealing His genius by making adaptable things. So how do we explain that adaptability? Well, let's make believe that the evolutionary explanation of random mutations coupled with this magical concept that they've introduced called natural selection is wrong. That should take a lot of convincing. And let's make believe that the Lord made these organisms adaptable right from the very beginning. How might they adapt? Well, they might adapt in a similar way as a man-made adaptable thing. Now, why would I expect similarities between God-made things and man-made things? Well, we go back to general revelation again. God said in His Word that we are His handiwork. We are the work of His hands. We are His workmanship. Now this is really, really important, because he says we can understand things about him by looking at his workmanship. Now how in the world do we even know what workmanship is unless we can compare it to things that we have made? And when we can compare it to things that we have made, and it corresponds to the things that God has made, we clearly see workmanship. We clearly see those features. So, taking the Bible at face value, I am expecting to see in living things signs of workmanship. In fact, I'm expecting to see a correspondence. I'm not expecting to find living things that can't be figured out. I'm expecting to find living things that can be figured out. I'm expecting that they will be highly discernible, and I'm even expecting that the same engineering principles which explain how man-made things work are probably going to explain how living things work. And when I see not a general correspondence, but a really, really tight correspondence between highly engineered man-made things with the same kind of systems and elements functioning the same way as God-made things, then the conclusion that these were designed is almost inescapable, because the man-made things were clearly what? Designed. Does that make sense? And that's the way we should probably approach biology. So, when I want to explain something like adaptation, I'm going to look for a man-made thing which is really adaptable. And I'm going to look and see if there's some corresponding elements. Well, man-made things that are adaptable, that relate to tracking targets, is a tracking system. A tracking system tracks moving targets like ships or planes. And it does it through three important elements. There are sensors, which sense what's moving. Does that make sense? There's data that comes into a logic center. It says, if it's here, then look here. If it's here, then look there. So you have logic and you have an output response. Well, maybe organisms are tracking changes in the environment through a totally purposeful, nothing random about it, mechanism that instead of tracking planes and ships, these organisms are tracking myriads of changing conditions. And they're doing it with, let's follow along, what? Sensors. Sensors. Sensors for all kinds of things. What was the next thing? Logic mechanisms. If you detect this, then express this trait. If you detect that, then express this trait. And output responses that have traits that correspond, that suit the changing conditions and can solve any problems of those changing conditions. Do organisms have those things? Yes, they do. They have sensors by the tens of thousands. They have incredible logic and they have output responses. Are they using them in the same way? The answer is yes, they are. And so that summarizes a lot of what I talked about last night. Organisms really do continuously track environmental changes. So, let's take it one step further for the creation-savvy people at Rocky Mountain. Let's talk about this type of tracking mechanism. It's called an anticipatory system. Now, nobody's talked to you about this in creation. So this is not a rerun. This is not a rehash. This is completely new for that. So organisms are tracking environmental changes. They can do that in real time. But, like an incredibly sophisticated man-made thing, they have look-out capability, where they can kind of look forward and anticipate what's coming and prepare for that. So, that's the formal title, but this would be the other title that I would come up with this talk right here, and it's simply called Adapting Today for Tomorrow's Challenges. That's a lot easier to understand. You adapt today for what you anticipate tomorrow's challenges will be. In other words, this is a system which kind of advises you how you ought to react or what you should do. Now that gal up there on the screen, she wants to know what? Go left or right. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if she could look over the hill Wouldn't that be great if you could look over the hill and see if a snowstorm's coming? Another thing's coming? Well, that's what anticipatory systems help you to do. They help you to kind of project what may be coming your way. And we, as engineers and humans, make anticipatory systems all the time. In 2006, this New Horizons spacecraft was launched. In 2006. And based on the fact that we can anticipate where planets and celestial objects are going to be based on mathematical precision, we can launch something in 2006, have it fly over 3 billion miles, and rendezvous with Pluto, less than 1,500 miles across, and fly within just several thousands of miles of it. But it doesn't do it totally automated, even as good as a God-made thing was, because New Horizons still is getting input from NASA and adjusting its course a little bit, whereas God-made things don't have that input. They do it totally autonomously. And then that spacecraft flew another 1 billion miles, and just on New Year's Day of this year, it rendezvoused with a rock that's only 23 miles across. And it flew within hundreds of miles of it. Now that's pretty precise anticipatory behavior, wouldn't you say? That's really cool, anticipatory behavior. But this paper came out on the same week as New Horizons, which flew by that rock. Look what the headline says. How foresight might support the behavioral flexibility of arthropods. Those are things like insects. And you'll see there on the right-hand side of the screen, you have that dragonfly. And it's going to track down a mosquito. But it's not going to get behind it and just fly it down and run it down. It builds within itself an internal program that is going to anticipate where the mosquito will be and set an interception course to do it. Now that's kind of cool, and this is what the paper says about that. Evidence of internal models. Stop right there. The key word is what kind of models? Internal. And last night I kind of beat the audience to death over external versus internal. Because what Darwin fundamentally changed is he went from seeing organisms having incredible internal capability as these incredible problem-solving entities to being passive modeling clay shaped by their environments. Does that ring a bell from anybody last night? But this tells it clearly there. Evidence of internal models in dragonfly behavior suggests use of a predictive model of the prey's trajectory and a copy of the dragonfly's own motor commands. So do you see this is a very complicated program. It's anticipating where that's going and what you're doing, and boom, it intercepts it in an anticipatory way. Well, these kind of models that can forecast what's coming are really, really technically challenging. You see the one up there that everybody recognizes, and that's weather forecasting. But then people do economic forecasting. What's it going to be like 6 months from now economically? It's tough. Weather's really tough. They don't always get it right on that. It's kind of tough to make these forecasts, but they can give us an idea maybe of what organisms are doing. Many adaptations, therefore, are not simply reactive in nature of what's happening right this moment, but many adaptations are proactive in nature. And they flow from innate logic-based programming that enables these creatures to have foresight. That's tough to program. And enables them to act preemptively of how they should adjust and how they are going to predict what external conditions are. Now this is really, really fascinating there, so that organisms are not simply reactive, but they're proactive. Now that takes a lot of engineering genius to put that together. And that's how the Lord is building these creatures. So rather than go through the whole model, let's just jump into some examples, okay? Let's just go into examples. This is a paper that was done on tomato plants, research that was done on tomato plants that can anticipate if they are going to be eaten by snails. And the snails don't even get to touch the plants. The snails are going along the ground and they leave behind what everybody likes to look at, snail mucus. So they leave along a trail of snail mucus there, and the plants can detect snail mucus. I mean, that's quite remarkable, to be able to detect some snail mucus. And this is what this paper says about the plants. New research now shows that some flora, those are plants, can detect an herbivore, that's a plant eater, animal, well before it launches an assault, letting a plant mount a what kind of a defense? Preemptive defense that even works against other species, in this case against some grasshoppers. None of the plants in their experiment were ever actually attacked. The lead investigator said, quote, "We just gave them cues that suggested an attack was coming." And that was enough to trigger big changes in their chemistry, where they had some anti-snail defenses out there. This paper, the original paper on the research, says this: a defensive response in plants that have not been attacked. And plants integrate the many sources of information regarding attack in their environments to optimize investment in defense. And it goes on to say, so that plants prioritize risk information, whereby information that is likely to be linked to greater imminent attack risk triggers a stronger defense. But you didn't realize plants were so sophisticated. They're never attacked. They know the attack's coming. And they can sense and prioritize an attack, like the snails over here, or the snails eating the plant already next to me, and they prioritize their defenses in anticipation of that. That is a cool anticipatory system, a preemptive system for what's coming. Well, not just plants, what about insects? And this is research that was done, obviously, on honeybees. And what this research did is you take honeybees, there's a developing a little larvae in the honeycomb, and you starve them. You starve these little things, but you don't kill them. You don't starve them to death. You starve them so they get stressed, and then when they grow up, you anticipate that they already have preemptive mechanisms to deal with starvation better than if they weren't starved. Because if you're starved as a developer, then maybe you're going to grow up in a starvation environment, and that's just exactly what happened with these honeybees there. This paper says, most organisms, not just honeybees, most organisms faced with environmental changes and stressors. In diverse organisms, there is an anticipatory mechanism during development that can program adult phenotypes. The adult phenotype would be adapted to the predicted environment that occurred during organism maturation. And therefore, they go on to say that they have an adaptive phenotypic changes that are induced not just physiological changes, but molecular changes and even behavioral changes. All of these are done across the board in anticipation of what's actually happening on that. They had surprisingly found that short-term starvation in the larval stage makes adult honeybees more adapted to adult starvation. This suggests that they have an anticipatory mechanism like solitary organisms do. Now, they had found these anticipatory mechanisms in organisms that live basically solitary lives, and this experiment was, if you have a social creature like a bee, would they still have anticipatory mechanisms, or would they rely on the social network? And the answer is they have anticipatory mechanisms as well. Now that is really a cool system. What about in others' lives, cross-generational? Can you have anticipatory mechanisms that are even broader than an individual organism, so that the entire anticipatory mechanism now includes parent and offspring? Wow, that would take an incredible level of programming. So that includes parents and offspring. And the answer is, of course, I wouldn't have brought it up if they did. This paper on error management says, changes in the parental phenotype. Phenotypes are just your repertoire of traits. It's all of your traits, your phenotype on that. Can act as a signal to offspring about the future environment that they will encounter. And these parental cues can induce adaptive plasticity in offspring characteristics, which they call adaptive transgenerational phenotypic plasticity, or adaptive parental effects. You know what that's saying? That's saying that mom, or dad, but it's mostly mom, is acting like this giant sensor of all the stresses and challenges she is facing in her environment. Baby is going to be born into that environment, so mom has cues. Mom does not change the baby. Sorry, moms, but you're not really building a baby inside of you. Baby is building itself inside of you. You provide a haven for that, but you're sending data to the baby, and baby, when it detects your data, starts to adjust itself for the environment that you are currently in. This goes on to say this. However, maternal stress can play adaptive roles across a wide variety of animal taxa as stress-induced phenotypes better prepare offspring for a stressful postnatal environment in mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish. So it's not just plants, it's not insects, it's basically across the board. It's across the board that we find these anticipatory systems here. Well, here's a great example, sea urchins. Sea urchins. Now these two researchers, I'll show you their picture in just a second, they took sea urchins that are normally raised under typical conditions of water temperature and water pH. Then they took some other sea urchins and they raised them at a stressful temperature and stressful pH, and females in both groups reproduced during that period of time. And of course, you're anticipating that the ones that were in the stressful conditions are better adapted already, in advance, on the day they are hatched for those stressful conditions. And that's just what they found. They found that transgenerational plasticity in situ could act as an important mechanism by which populations might keep pace with, i.e. track, rapid environmental changes. Who's come up with an idea that organisms are tracking environmental changes? We have. ICR. This means that your creationist community is well ahead of the scientific community in framing a model to explain this. Well ahead. And they're using this to track these changes. Well, Wong and Hoffman did the research, these two gals. Hoffman, the lead researcher, she said this. This is a great quote. It's almost like the female could sense that her progeny were about to be released in some challenging conditions for early stage development. In response, she primed her offspring and gave them tools to face stressful conditions. It's like she packed them a backpack of tools. That's quite remarkable. That mom is prepping offspring for the environment that she's going to be in. Well, not just sea urchins, but these tiny little things called roundworms. These roundworms were born into a stressful environment, and it says that maternal diet can influence this. So what you do is you stress mom, in this case it was against starvation, and she gives birth, and the roundworms that she gives birth to are already prepped for that environment. And it says information from a mother's environment can be transmitted to her offspring. How do they do that? Magic? No. No magic. We describe a genetic network that mediates the effects of mother's diet on the size and starvation resistance of her offspring. It goes right through genetics. But mom does not change the genes of her offspring. Evolutionists get this wrong all the time. How can I reach into your body and change your genes? None. You can't. No organism violates the barrier of another organism and changes their genes. That's an evolutionary view that's totally externalistic. I present you data, and when you detect the data, you what? Change your own genes. That's how it works. And they change in real time on that. Fitness consequences of maternal effects hinge on anticipation of conditions. And they develop what's called a thrifty phenotype. I mentioned this last night, which proposes that children of mothers of malnourished during pregnancy are programmed to store more energy in anticipation of limited nutrient availability. Metabolic programming, anticipation of environmental conditions in their progeny. Well, that's what happens with these worms. The headline of the research from Duke, where the research was done, says these animals, the offspring, are able to anticipate adverse conditions based on their mother's experience. Mom somehow provisions the embryo or programs it. Any problem with that quote?
Yeah.
Yes. What's the problem? Mom?
She doesn't have a master's or PhD in genetic programming.
That's exactly right. Exactly. Mom, so these researchers, because they're not thinking like engineers, and they're not thinking like how something had to be built, because they've probably never built anything in their life, they don't know how it has to work. Mom does not have a PhD in genetics, therefore she cannot program her offspring. She presents them data. But in the big picture, it's right. But mom cannot program her offspring. And this is, evolutionists get this wrong. This is where we can help it by thinking like engineers and explaining things like engineers, because we really believe that they were designed. And this is where it puts us way ahead of our evolutionary counterpart. Here's another cool one. This was research done on sheep. So now we've moved to mammals. Can mammals prep their young? Well, they do. So you take this female sheep, what do you think they did to her while she's pregnant? They starve her. I mean, they don't starve her to death, but they restrict her calories, because that's an easy thing to do, and it's easy to measure. I give you so many calories, I give you less on that. So it's easy to do as an experiment. And then you check and see if the offspring have resistance to those kinds of things. Are they changed? And in this case, they checked males and females to see if there was any changes of them. And the males did not have any change. Semen quality of 20 months of age of the males was unaffected by prenatal undernutrition. But ovulation rate of, this is who? The females. In Texas, I kind of have to prep them on that a little bit. You get down there and they're like, what? What? Anyway, ovulation rate was significantly reduced in low, that is starved, versus high, that's offspring of non-starved, female offspring. That is really cool. That has implications even past anticipatory systems. What is that saying? Mom is in a starvation environment, a calorie-restricted environment. She gives birth to offspring. What happens to the ovulation rate of her females? It goes what? Down. You know what that's saying? That's saying, this is a cool provision, that instead of having a bunch of offspring where there's not enough food to feed them all and a bunch of them starve to death, you do what with the population? You reduce it. Wow. Finally, a big wow of someone who catches that this is a program of great provision by the Lord. Of great provision. So instead of having a bunch of starving offspring, which evolutionists just love, because it's survival of the what? Fittest. We're not starving them. You reduce the reproduction rate. And guess what happens with reproduction when the food availability goes back? It goes back. That's kind of cool. What about humans? Someone asked me last night, well, are humans doing this? Yes. Some creatures have a broader range of anticipatory systems, but humans do it as well on that. And this was I even mentioned this research last night. This was research done on looking at females, and it was testing their hypothesis of predictive adaptive response. Now this was kind of a tough experiment. It was done by some foreigners, and so in the paper they call them skinny babies and fat babies. Now nobody would do that these days, skinny babies and fat babies. But they're looking at the response of girls who were born as skinny or basically undernourished babies versus fat babies or nourished babies. And they're looking at their birth weight, and they're also then looking at their growth from birth to 6 months of age. And they're anticipating with this predictive adaptive response right there, on that, they're predicting that female offsprings that were born to starved mothers are going to react to starvation different in their life than fatter babies will react to starvation in their life. And they're also predicting, just like with the sheep, that their ovulation rates will go down. So that's what they're checking. And that's what they exactly found in this case. The central claim of the predictive adaptive hypothesis is that developmental changes that are associated with energy constraints on fetal growth, that's whether you're going to be born what, skinny or fat, are essentially adaptive, preparing the organism for a predicted range of environments it is likely to encounter in adult life. So then you have the history on these females, and they volunteer for this, and you put them in a caloric-restricted environment, and you also increase their energy expenditures by increasing their output at work and through home chores. You work them harder, and then you check and see what happens to them. In this case, they found that the levels of estradiol in women born in the highest neonatal nutritional status were 37 to 46% higher, respectively, than levels of estradiol in women born in the lower nutritional status. And ovulation rates were down. That even happens in humans. Now here's another, this is a response on this. This study, then, the conclusion is, represents to their knowledge the first direct test of adaptive nature in female programming on humans. Those probably happening in humans. But what about males? Well, this paper also came out. Now, by the way, these papers are published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's what PNAS stands for. Here's another PNAS paper. Rapid weight gain after birth predicts life history and reproductive strategy in Filipino males. Now, this is a fascinating study on that. They looked at maternally derived ecological cues, maternally derived ecological cues. You know, scientists just can't write in plain English. Maternally derived ecological cues, meaning what? The things that mom is sensing in her environment and the things that are happening to her, transferred via the placenta, that's data, or breast milk, in other words, she's being starved while she's breastfeeding, could convey information about typical energetic and social experiences in the past, and thus allow the developing organism to modify biological settings in anticipation of conditions that are likely to be experienced in the future. In other words, baby boys that are born to malnourished women might develop one way and the other. So they're looking at birth weight again, and they're looking at growth from birth to 6 months of age in these Filipino males. So they get all this from past history. And this is what they found. Developmental plasticity in response to nutrients and hormones during fetal and infancy development can modify growth patterns, adult metabolism, and hormone regulation. What they found is this. Males with rapid birth to 6 month growth reached puberty earlier, and as adults had higher testosterone levels, were taller, more muscular, and had higher grip strength. In other words, they were a lot like me. And they found out, you know, this was what the paper glued, so I don't print all this stuff, is that these really macho guys, did they get more girls or less girls than the less macho guys? More girls, of course, they're like me. As I said, they get more girls, and therefore they leave more offspring in this particular case. What do you know? I was a 9-pound baby on that. So it fits the bill. All right. Now this was another one I referenced last night. This is actually a sadder study. This is on study on Chinese people who were the offspring of parents who lived through a terrible famine. A famine that was induced by the government, not nature. The government had a terrible idea for redistributing food, and it led to a famine from 1959 to 1962 where over 30 million Chinese people starved to death. It's a bunch on that. And that's why when I was growing up in the 60s, my mom would say, eat all the food on your plate because there's starving children in China. And I never knew where in the world she's getting that from, but I was always concerned about starving children in China as a kid growing up. That's because there was this terrible famine. Well, this is a study showing on an environmental mismatch. So, we already know that there's the thrifty phenotype. You have parents who are being starved in this famine. She's still pregnant. She's going to give birth to children. They're going to have the thrifty phenotype, which means they're going to hoard their calories and tend to store them as fat. Because, in anticipation of the starvation environment that mom is in, baby's anticipated to be born in what? Starvation environment. But things changed in China, and they did not grow up in a starvation environment. They grew up in a calorie-rich environment. The same thing happened in America. And so now you have this tendency to store all this stuff as fat, and you're growing up in a calorie-rich environment, and therefore you end up developing disease because there's a mismatch. And in this particular case, the odds of developing hyperglycemia were 2 to 1 in both the children and the grandchildren who were born to parents who were starved. And the risk of getting type 2 diabetes was 75% higher. That's because they have this tendency to store, but they didn't need to store it. So you had an environmental mismatch. Okay, have I built a case that there's anticipatory systems across the board? Yes. They're kind of predicting what's happening, and it happens in your life, it can happen transgenerationally. That's quite remarkable. Quite remarkable what we see. Well, how in the world are we going to explain this? Well, evolutionists have their mechanism for explaining things on that. And they start to explain it by pointing out that these organisms are able to have foresight. And they anticipated that the small brains of insects and other vertebrates are often thought to constrain these animals to live entirely in the moment. But they're not living in the moment. Now, why were they thinking that they would only live in the moment? Because they thought they had what kind of a brain? A primitive brain and primitive systems. Because insects are supposedly more primitive than mammals. But they find out they're not more primitive at all. Even though they have brains with far, far fewer neurons than we do, it's how they're wired that matters. And they have these great anticipatory systems that allow them not to live in the moment. And they propose that a basic form of foresight, the ability to predict the outcomes of one's own actions, is at the heart of such behavioral flexibility. But, and this is kind of good for us, they say we currently have no information about the circuitry at which this happens. Basically saying this, we recognize there are anticipatory systems, we recognize there are these anticipatory outcomes, but how they work, what? Nobody really knows yet how they work on that. Where they are able to imagine possible future states or problem solutions. But we hypothesize that evolutionary beginnings of such forward-planning circuits may have been found in early arthropods with spatially explicit sense organs such as image-forming eyes. Let me translate. What they're saying is, as far back as we go in the fossil record, we find anticipatory behaviors. So it's not something that what? Evolved slowly. And they're saying that these anticipatory behaviors are probably tied to what? A sensor. They're tied to a sensor. What's the sensor? Image-forming eyes. Now, we can start to tie it into some engineering explanations. Because we say organisms are tracking environmental changes, and I told you the first element of a tracking system is what? It's a sensor. It's a sensor. You have to know what's happening around you. And that's why they have these sensors. So you have foresight. Here's your favorite evolutionist and mine. Who's that? Richard Dawkins. Now he's going to explain the major evolutionary mechanism, which is what? natural selection. And I went into this long explanation last night of why this is a fundamentally misleading construct. It's inherently misleading and can never be made non-misleading. Because you cannot compare nature to a human breeder with a real brain who can really select between roses and cattle and all kinds of things to nature which doesn't have a brain. Therefore, the projection and the ascription of selective capacity to nature is fundamentally wrong. And it can never be made right. It's a misnomer. You know what a misnomer is? It's something that's wrongly labeled. Organisms live and the organisms die, but nature can never select for them. And it's this magical explanation which nature selects, which it can never do. However, in the evolutionist mind, as they conceive of natural selection, and many of you probably do too, he says it's what? It's a blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered. No, he didn't. He invented. He invented this word for it, in which we now know is the explanation for the existence of an apparently purposeful form of all life. Has no purpose. What has no purpose? Natural selection. And has no purpose in mind. It has no mind, in no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. Well, he's true on all of that bottom stuff, because it's just something that exists in his mind. But as he conceives it, it has no foresight, no purpose, no nothing. How about this evolutionist, Francis Crick? He wrote about natural selection. He said, I suspect that some people also dislike the idea that natural selection has no foresight. The process itself, in effect, does not know where to go. It is what did I tell you yesterday? Environments. It's the environment that provides the direction. Is he an internalist or externalist? He's an externalist. Now, in just 2 nights, you're fully educated on spotting this stuff. Anytime you see someone who says the environment is running the show, you immediately know they're an externalist, environmentalist. Some people call externalists environmentalists. It's all the same. They see the environment as running the show. What?
And it's all a lie.
It's all a lie. Because it's all happening just in their mind. And over the long run, its effects are largely unpredictable in detail. Now here's another one. Actually, I like this guy, Jonathan Losos. He's another evolutionist. He's an externalist. And he just wants to tell everybody as he writes his book, remember that natural selection has what? No foresight. It will not favor a mutation. Stop right there, people who were at the lecture last night. Do you see any personification in that phrase? Natural selection won't do what? Favor. Now, how many of us as creationists have been running over this language and not giving it a second thought? But it's a massive personification. Obviously, natural selection can't favor it because it doesn't have a mind. But he writes about it as if it did. It will not favor mutation because it will be useful in the future. So this is how bankrupt their explanation is. They have a death-driven mystical process. Can natural selection ever be anything but death-driven? No! It is always death-driven, so as Christians, we should find that repugnant, because in the selectionist worldview, which many creationists even adopt, death is the means to good. They see death as a way to get rid of all your crummy genes and get them out of the population, particularly if you're sick, particularly if you've got a disease, particularly if you're weak. And so it's like God's eugenics. Just get rid of it all. We should find that repugnant, because the Bible doesn't say that death is the means to good. The Bible says death is a what? Enemy. Death is a curse. And death will be destroyed. So there's just so many things wrong with this worldview. But this is it. It's this mystical substitute agent. Why do I say that? Because they're trying to get God's agency out and bring in a substitute agency of nature where God can really select and God can really make choices, and they put in nature as the substitute agent for God supposedly selecting and making choices and having volition. However, in their view, it has no purpose, no desire, no consciousness, and no foresight. But this is the problem. All of these creatures that we see seem to act as if they have what? Purpose, desire, consciousness, foresight, and anticipation. Now tell me how much sense that makes. You believe in a process which has no purpose, no foresight, no anticipation, no consciousness, and it's building creatures that are totally driven by purpose, totally have desires, clearly has consciousness, even in Texas. All of those places. Desires, all of that. That makes no sense. No sense at all on there. So, as we said last night, we need to do biology as if Darwin had never been born. Let's break away from that stuff. Let's the dead bury the dead. And let's do for biology what the Genesis record did for geology. And let's come up with a completely design-based explanation. Or what creatures seem to be doing. And this is how you begin. You look and you observe carefully. You read all those papers which we just read. And you said, what are these creatures doing? Well, they seem to be able to anticipate or predict environmental changes. And then they seem to produce really purposeful responses. That's what they're doing. How are they doing it? Well, they self-adjust by numerous innate mechanisms. And why do they do it? Well, they seem to be able to do it. Why they're doing it is to be able to track environmental changes so that they can maintain homeostasis. Remember homeostasis from 8th grade biology? That's the way you maintain your stability in a changing environment. That's what they seem to be doing. Well, if they were designed to adapt, then we would have a model. Now, we're not going to go over this poster, but I've presented this poster at multiple scientific meetings, which says that organisms seem to be able to continuously track environmental changes. And the basic assumption is that the same engineering principles which explain man-made things are going to explain God-made things. In other words, biological functions are going to be accurately explained by engineering principles. And I'm expecting corresponding elements between anticipatory systems that are man-made and anticipatory systems that are God-made. And I'm expecting that they're going to use sensors to track their environment with logic and output responses, which we've already talked about. And as this little diagram shows, even at the cellular level, there are sensors and logic. Logic that happens long before you get to the nucleus, long before you get to the DNA. Data is being processed so that there can be an appropriate response to that. So we have a key. If we know how design things operate, we can be greatly informed by that when we're studying biological things. In other words, I'm suggesting that engineering and biology is a two-way street. We all know that biologists look at some design things in living creatures and we steal those designs and we implement them into what? Man-made technology. And we never give the designer credit for it. We steal the stuff and we never give credit. What I'm saying is, yeah, we can look at biological things and steal technological things, but if I'm expecting a correspondence, I can look at man-made technology, and if I'm trying to figure out how a biological thing works, maybe knowing how this works can give me clues at how this works. Does that make sense? It goes both ways. And I'm anticipating that it'll be fully internal. Because when we build things, we build their capacity completely inside of them. Now, Robert Rosen, he's passed away now, but this gentleman, he was the leading researcher on anticipatory systems. And it's really a mathematical system that he's built here, but he gave a definition of them. And he said, an anticipatory system is a natural system that contains what? An internal predictive model of itself and its environment, which allows it to change state in an instant in accord with the model's predictions pertaining to a later instant. Translated, it allows you to adapt today for what you anticipate is coming tomorrow. And you're doing it because you have an internal model of yourself and you have a model of your environment. Now that's cool. Now, where should we find such things like that? Well, is it internal? This paper on Foresight said, based on their research, locust grasshoppers and dragonflies and flies seem to use what? Internal models of the surrounding world to tailor their actions adaptively to predict imminent future. That's quite interesting there. Evidence, here's another paper, of an internal model of the neural circuit level has been shown in fruit flies. These examples highlight an important aspect of internal models whereby the state of the system should modulate processing of sensory information. In other words, what you anticipate is coming enables you to interpret your incoming information even differently. So how, this is a chance where we, as creationists, can predict what these models may be. Because remember, the evolutionists don't have a clue of how they work yet. So here's a model. It's the weather model. We use these things to try to predict what's coming. How in the world do weather models work? Well, if you download this paper, they'll explain to you what's in a weather model. First, there are mathematical equations characterizing the physics of the phenomenon. Clouds operate in certain ways, evaporation operates in certain ways, and you can develop the physics to make a model of those things. Is that understandable? Two, they collect data of current conditions from radar, weather, balloons, all kinds of things they send up, and they're collecting data on current conditions. Three, there is a storage of past trends of what happens with the weather. And then four, there is another set of equations which are able to run something faster than real time, where you take past trends, incoming data, and your models of clouds, you roll these all together, and you get your weather predictions. Are weather predictions better a week out or the day before? The day before. Because they're able to run the model and they're able to get better data. What if organisms with anticipatory systems have these same elements? Remember I said last time I'd make a prediction. I'm going to make a prediction that when the research comes out based on this, and when people start to figure out these anticipatory systems and creatures, they're going to have something like programmed equations inside of them. Sensory data on their current conditions, stored reference data, and a mechanism to step forward in time and anticipate. And this is not in print yet. So the next time someone comes up to you and they say, well, you creationists don't do real research, you don't make any predictions. Yes, we do. I'm predicting that these creatures will have these kind of elements in their anticipatory systems, because man-made systems have them. And in many ways, this is how it has to work. Now, someone's going to say, is it possible to even store equations in there? And what will they do for you? Well, I'm saying, yes, it is possible, and that the foresight of these anticipatory systems is going to act as an input for other systems within the organism and on which to base its decisions. So, when you watch the weather tonight, if you're home in time, the weather guy is going to, or gal, is going to give you an output. And you're going to take that as an input, and then what do you do with that data? You decide whether you're going to mow the grass or stay inside and watch TV, because it's going to be raining. If you're in Texas, you do what? You just stay inside. They don't mow their own grass. That's right. But here, or whether you need to shovel snow. You see what I'm saying? Is the anticipatory system is an input for you to make decisions. That's what organisms do. They have a separate anticipatory system of which the output becomes an input on which to make decisions even during development. And that's probably how they'll work on there. Well, someone will say, is it possible to model physics? Well, this paper, does the brain model Newton's laws? That's an interesting one. This was an experiment which was done on astronauts, and it's a simple one. You throw them a ball. The ball goes up and it comes down by gravity. And you catch the ball. And then you take them up in space and you throw a ball. And you watch them try to catch it on that. You do those kinds of things, and you find out that the brain already has a model to predict the action of gravity on a ball. And your brain is modeling this, and I skipped all the mathematics in this paper, but they say this: we conclude, therefore, that when catching a falling ball, the nervous system uses a second order what? Internal model. And for you people who want to know what it was, the ratio of the size of the object's retinal image to its rate of change. That's what was built in. Of gravity to estimate time to catch. So we already know that in your body and in your brain, you already have these models. They can model mathematical things, and it's in there. Now this is a huge area for fun future research on that, but we can have those. And therefore, nobody, any creature, is left without direction in many ways. And I would say even spiritually, nobody is left without direction.
Amen.
The Lord gives you anticipatory systems, but He also gives you a way to anticipate what's coming in this future life, which you already read about in Revelation.
Including His Word.
That's what I mean. It's including His Word. He doesn't leave without direction in any way. Well, we want to get on to the second talk, and we want to have people get a chance to stretch their legs and break. So I'll take about 5 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll take a break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes after that for there. So, thank you. I'll start off with the first question. How many of you have signed up for Acts and Facts? Most of you probably have. If you haven't, shame on you. It is a free resource for you. Free. Made by donors to this ministry, where you can stay current on things, and we'll have articles even on anticipatory systems. Out at the table in the room is a sign-up sheet. If you have not signed up for Acts and Facts, please sign up for that. There are some other resources out there which are very, very useful to you too. I don't make a dime off of them, but they're good for education. There's some books on creation basics will educate you. Our major evolutionary blunders, which is brand new, tell you how all these things that evolutionists have messed up. Okay, my commercial's over. First question. Yes, sir. Do you want to step to the mic?
Yeah,
or do you want to
they
just hand it to them? Okay. Or you can just talk loud.
You go through all these anticipatory systems and so forth with biology. Does the same thing exist with psychology, for instance, and the operation of the brain, the way people operate? The things you get into with psychology, is it the same sort of systems?
And the answer is probably yes. I don't know if it's going to operate in the exact same mechanism, but clearly people have developed anticipatory responses and behaviors psychologically from that. So I don't know exactly if it's the same mechanism that I'm talking about, but to answer your question, are there psychological anticipatory systems and responses? The answer is clearly yes, without a doubt. Yes, sir. If you want to just talk, or you want to come out?
I thought.
Okay.
On the transgenerational adaptation, I'm dying to know whether they were able to go back after the fact and see, after seeing this adaptation take place, have they been able to identify any genetic changes in the offspring as compared to the parents?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Wow.
There's genetic changes and there are epigenetic changes for both. Man, you scared me for a second. I thought he was going to say transgenerational. Gender. Oh, yes, sir.
I was thinking in particular, like with the desert fox opposed to the Arctic fox, and the way that God has made them. And I was wondering about getting this information and changing that much the difference between the two animals. But on the other hand, I was also thinking, we were talking about internal. Could it be possible it's also external because God himself is giving them data?
Well, it could be.
You know, like it says of Jesus, by him all things consist.
Yes, it certainly could be on that, in the sense that I would allow for God's external intervention to do something that I couldn't do, or you couldn't do, or other things couldn't do. So in that sense, it could be that God is externally giving a direction or giving those things.
That could explain the big changes
It might be.
animals, right?
It is. The hitch on that, and explaining it to evolutionary friends or colleagues or anybody else, is that there's no way I can detect God's interventions on that. Do I believe God intervenes? Of course. Does everybody in this room believe that God intervenes? We do. We all believe that. But we don't have a way to directly say, oh, here's God intervening.
We don't have sensors.
We don't have that kind of a sensor. And maybe we don't have those sensors for angelic host. But like the servant of Elisha, God allowed him to see something that was there. Remember that? Opened his eyes to see angels. And they were there all along. It wasn't they just suddenly appeared. They're there, but we just don't have the sensor to see that. And so it takes an intervention to see that. And so all of us see that God does intervene, and we believe he does intervene, but I can't, and you can't either. We can't point out and say, here's a God intervention, because we don't have a detector to do that. So that's something we hold by faith. So from a scientific standpoint, I can't appeal to these. And you know, the theistic evolutionists try to do the same thing, and they're in the same bind. They basically hold to the evolutionary process, and when they hit all of the hurdles that evolution has, they bring in what? Well, God got over the hurdle. God got him over the hurdle. God got him over the hurdle. But can they show that God got him over any of those hurdles? No. So from a scientific standpoint, they're kind of bankrupt. Yes, sir.
Are there biological systems that are not affected by what you've been talking about? For example, like the bacterial flagellum and things like that, they exist within the cells themselves. They're not, are they even, can they be affected by those cells?
Well, probably, the answer is, are there some systems and elements on you that are probably not affected? The answer is true. Probably yes.
Okay.
On that, as an engineer, and this is why I'm expecting this, I would probably design something where I want certain things to be adaptable and certain things to be static. So I'm anticipating the same thing within living organisms based on what an engineer might do. And now, please don't misunderstand. I did not say God had to do something like an engineer, did I? God's totally free to do it. I said God did do it like an engineer. And there's a big difference. I'm not saying God had to do it. I'm saying he did do it, and he does it for a purpose so that it's unmistakable, given this is designed and this operates just like it, that it's also designed. And that birds fly by the same principles that airplanes fly by. Could God have made birds to fly by different principles than airplanes? Of course he could have, but he didn't. They fly by the same physics, same rules, same aerodynamics as birds do. And I praise God because we can study birds, and by studying birds we can build airplanes on that.
And we're not very quick at it either until coming in.
That's right. Well, I will take any more questions. It is 8:30. We want to be done by 9. So I have 8:20. Let's be back at 8:30. And if you want to go home, that's fine. But if you want to get to the second talk, I'll do the second talk hopefully between 8:30 and 9. Sound good? Back to then. Thank you very much. When somebody's talking to you about adaptation and those kinds of things, you have a completely better model to explain adaptation, an internal model. It says organisms are what? Continuously tracking environmental changes with what? Sensors. Sensors. What was the next one? Logic and output responses. And these mechanisms even enable them to anticipate future things, and they can even cross generations. You know what you say? If you say that to your friends, they're going to go, what? They're going to just be like blown away on that. They're going to say, wow, I thought it was random mutations. And you're going to just be way, way ahead of them. Okay. 5 minutes with the Darwinist. We have all evolution, we have Darwinian friends on that, and we want to talk to them. This is what I did for the students the other day. I'm doing my abbreviated student talk. In other words, your friend thinks he's related to a chimp. Now what are you going to say to him and all of that? Well, we need an effective way to talk to our evolutionary friends. We don't even have a whole lot of time. And we are going to use this acronym. You guys have a book? So the good news is you don't even have to take notes. You can pick up that free book on all of this. F, focus of discussion. Now, this is very useful. And next week I'm going to do a radio interview. I will use this during my radio interview. I'm going to say, wow, focus of discussion. I'm going to define some terms. I'm going to use this phrase, less than persuaded. I'm going to talk about 2 unobserved important events. A failed mechanism for design, and then finally the freedom found in creation science. So that's what's in your book, and you should follow along and follow those. First, and I'm going to try to get this done in about a half hour, focus the discussion, which means that since time is limited, we need to define some terms and use some reputable sources. Every now and then you get someone who will challenge you on your source. I was speaking at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I was talking about natural selection. I was talking about evolution, and this professor said, "No, who said that's what evolution means?" And I said, "The National Association of Biology Teachers." Oh, on that. And she thought evolution just simply meant change. Well, everybody realizes that things change, but the National Association of Biology Teachers, and they pulled this partly from their web, says the diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution. That's good. That's what the debate is over. Not whether something changes, but whether evolution can really explain the diversity of life on Earth. So, I'll say during the radio interview, now, when I'm talking about evolution, I'm talking about something that supposedly can explain the diversity of life on Earth, which is what the National Association of Biology Teachers claims. Was that fast? Wow. And it's just like bang, just like that. And now I've narrowed it from just arguing about change or changes in gene frequencies to something which is really the guts of the issue. And then, when I'm talking about science, I hold that science is based on observation and testing. Observation and testing. That's what science is. Now people are even beginning to weasel on science. They're trying to say that science mandates, I didn't say this to the students the other day, natural explanations. Only. That's a baloney, that's right. It doesn't mandate natural explanations. But they're saying true science must have natural explanations. Only on that. So, those are the first 2 terms. Now, I normally do a little quiz. And with the high school students, I did smart side versus dumb side with them. They thought that was pretty cool on that. So, were you on the smart side or dumb side last time? You were on dumb side. Okay. Well, how about we put you on the smart side? Well, you're evolving. So, anybody on the smart side here, what is evolution supposed to explain?
Diversity of life.
Diversity of life on Earth. Or maybe Mars, if they're really... Okay, dumb side. Science is based on?
Observation and testing.
There you go, observation and testing. A little slow, but that was all right. It finally came out, observation and testing, good. All right.
I don't know how to spell the word observation.
Neither do I, particularly when I'm writing on a whiteboard. There's something about writing on a whiteboard where you go brain dead when it comes to spelling on that, particularly if it's English. And I was taught phonics. The problem with phonics is in English, the letters can be submitted in different ways. Okay. Less than persuaded. This is my favorite picture. She's less than persuaded. Is she not? She really is. So just remember that look on that. And I don't know. I see women make that look all the time. And then you're telling them something, they're like, I've learned not to trust men. Anyway, as if we would have relied on women. I mean, we were supposed to hear a bunch of men say, amen. We never relied on women on
We know
that.
better.
What was that?
We know better. We're sitting next to them.
They know better on that. Well, anyway, this is a great phrase because we don't want to just start off with saying, I don't believe in evolution. That's a showstopper. And I don't believe in creation. And that doesn't get anywhere on that. So I have to tell you, I hear that all the time. You start the conversation with the evolutionary friends and you just lead off with, well, I don't believe in evolution. Well, then why have the conversation? So, this is a great phrase which says we've been listening carefully to what our teachers have been telling us, to what we hear on NOVA, National Geographic, all those things. We've been really listening carefully, but we're less than persuaded, because when they're trying to tell us that evolution explains the diversity of life on Earth, all we get are, I know that's kind of small print up there, is evidence for different varieties of dogs, different varieties of cats, different varieties of things, but nobody ever explains to you where dogs came from and where cats came from. We all know you can get all different types of dogs and cats. We all know where they came from. Changes in finch beaks. As if that's, I mean, the evidence that they find so persuasive to explain the diversity of life on Earth is the finch beak changed by 1 millimeter. I mean, it's so silly. Tell me where finches came from. And if you can't tell me that, tell me where the material to make a beak came from.
God.
Well, then, yeah, you're right. You're homeschooled. That's the difference on that. Observations of changes of frequencies of peppered moths. Now, if we had the time, I would tell you that you get the changes in frequencies in peppered moths. And if I were to say, explain to me how that happens, many creationists would come up with a natural selection story. Well, there was all these moths, and then the cert turned black, and then the white one stood out like a sore thumb, and the birds came down and what? Oh, so now you've embraced this death-driven view, and that left all the black ones to reproduce, and they took over the population. We can do much better than that. If we read the scientific literature, we find out that there's DNA that can move around on your chromosome. It's called transposable DNA. And when it moves, it changes the expression of certain genes. And a paper was published about 3 years ago that looked at the genes for making black coloration. And a huge segment of transposable DNA, over 20,000 bases long, boom, and it lands right in the promoter of the black color. And over 96% of the black moths have this transposable element right in the promoter making black color. And of the white moths, 0 have that transposable element. Huh. That sounds like a controlled mechanism, boom, plopping a transposable element right on a promoter. And say we don't have to go to those silly selectionist stories because the evidence is going to back up what's really happening. So there is a transposable element which turns the moths black. What nobody has researched is what causes that mobile piece of element to move and why does it consistently land here in these black conditions. So that's better than that silly story about the moths eating them, getting eaten and stuff. Observations of similarities in body parts. Tell me where the body parts came from, such as bones and things like that. Observations of resistance in bacteria to antibiotics. Oh, How might you explain antibiotic resistance now? You come up with that story about a couple mutations making them bacteria resistant, and the antibiotic did what to the rest of them? Killed them, leaving the few survivors to happen? Or might you suspect that the bacteria already have the ability to be resistant in advance, and they can detect those antibiotics, and therefore they express resistant traits? Isn't that better? Isn't that? Anyway, this is the evidence we get for evolution, and even if we didn't have the clarifications I just gave on those things, it doesn't explain the diversity of life on Earth, plain and simple. We're less than persuaded because of two unobserved important events. And these are fundamental to evolution. If evolution is true, one, you got to get life started, and two, you have to change it from one kind to a fundamentally different kind. That's basic. Well, on the first point, origin of life, nobody is close to explaining that. Nobody saw it happen, but this is more important. Nobody's close to duplicating or even explaining it. Why is it so hard? Well, because in order to explain how living things function, you have to explain at least four major things that all living things do. All living things grow. All living things adapt. All living things metabolize, that is, they take resources from their environment, they build themselves up, or they turn them to energy. And all living things reproduce. So in order to explain living things, you have to come up with mechanisms that explain what? All four of these babies. And they are incredibly complicated. That's why nobody can come up with it. Besides, every one of them has chicken and egg scenarios within them. I mean, as I mentioned to somebody during the break, how can you adapt until you are adaptable? You have to be adaptable before you adapt. But evolutionists explain you get your features by adapting. But you can't get adaptability by adaptation because you're not what? Adaptable yet. So you have to be adaptable before you can adapt. How do you get evolution to happen from one generation to the next until you can reproduce? How can you reproduce until you have energy from the environment? So not only do you have chicken and egg scenarios in each one of those, you have chicken and egg scenarios between them. Between them. That's why they're stymied on explaining all of this. And that's why this paper, this is actually 2011, on reporting on an origin of life contention. So don't tell the creationists, but scientists don't have a clue of how life began. That says a lot. Why would you not tell the creationists? I mean, isn't evolution like this science, this open search for truth on all of that? But look what the first sentence of this is. I didn't mention this to high school students. Exactly 20 years ago, I wrote an article for Scientific American that in draft form had the headline above. My editor nixed it. But now he's able to print it 20 years later. I'm going to predict that 20 years from now he'll have the same headline. Because it's just really, really hard to get over. And then second, as I mentioned, a mechanism to change a creature, not varieties within a kind, but from one kind to a fundamentally different kind. It's never been observed. Even something as simple as bacteria don't change. They can change varieties, you can change strains, but you don't go from a staph to a strep to E. coli. They just don't change. So evolutionists claim, well, they stabilized 3 billion years ago. They stabilized. How convenient. And everything else has evolved away. These have stabilized 3 billion years ago. So I'm not looking for just simple varieties of dog and even your new puppy. All of that there. I love that little dachshund. It's like, what's next? I wish there were some bullying rules, in existence in the dog world. Okay, this one. This is the hardest one of the bunch, but it's probably the most important. A failed mechanism for design. And I spent quite a bit of time in yesterday's talk on what Darwin was to do. Because everybody looks at creatures and they all agree they're really complex and they really look designed. You're not going to get Richard Dawkins to come out and say something so dopey as to say, that doesn't look designed. He recognizes it's designed. You'll get some evolutionists that will come out and say, they'll make claims for bad design or poor design, but when you examine them, they don't know what they're talking about. They have no clue what they're talking about. They're just repeating things that they've said. But most evolutionists won't come out and say that things don't look designed. Darwin never did that. He readily admits these things look designed. And now there's two explanations for it. The first one is our explanation, which says they look designed because they what? They are designed. They were designed. So I would say to my creationist friends and colleagues, if we claim that organisms look designed because they are designed, then fellow creationists, let's start explaining them in terms of design. In terms of design. Let's come up with design-based explanations that explain these things. We actually have the easier case. As I mentioned to the students the other day, this is the natural explanation for anybody on the planet, just about. They want to explain in terms of design. And as I mentioned, I have several papers on research on small children. And this is transnational research. Now when you go to children, particularly between the ages of 6 and 10, and you show them a dog, a cat, a puppy, or any of those things, and you ask these children, where did this come from? Children naturally say what? God made it. God made it. And it takes reprogramming of their brain to get that natural intuition out and to replace it with something like random mutations.
The lie of random.
The lie of random mutations. So evolutionists say that the design is only an illusion of design. It only looks like it was designed, but it really wasn't designed because there isn't a real designer. And so what's their substitute designer? Natural selection. That's always going to be it.
Lying eyes.
Lying eyes. And so in their view, evolution is based on mutations coupled to random natural selection. This is the dominant evolutionary view. Some evolutionists are pushing back on this because they even realize that this doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's not going to really explain evolution at all. Let's pick on mutations first. In their view, they claim that these mutations are random. Why? Why do they consistently claim they're random? Because that's right. That's right. It's an anti-design claim. It's an anti-design claim. To claim that something is random or undirected is the opposite of directed. And if they claim things are directed, that points to design. So even though they don't have any evidence to show, how would you know if any mutation was random or not? They have to claim that they're random on that. But, and I didn't say this to the students the other day, but the term mutation needs a lot better explanation. Because mutation just generally means any change in DNA. Any change in DNA. But what most people think of mutations, they think of what? Random things that cause diseases, that break stuff. And that's because they generally do. And probably most diseases are going to have a genetic element to them of which something is broken. So, this makes no sense. I mean, this takes a lot of faith, believe in something that generally causes diseases and is at the root of most cancers, if not all cancers, is the way that you're going to improve life on Earth. It just makes no sense.
Well, you just need more time.
That's right. You need more time. What does time do? Time is like a big smoke screen, particularly when you throw out billions of years because it's totally incomprehensible to the human brain. And so it totally fogs the issue. And it lets something that is totally unbelievable become believable because of enough time on that. But the point is, if you're talking to your friends, nobody wants mutations. I mention this to the kids because they're teenagers, so their brain's always thinking in terms of hormones and stuff like that. When I brought out, when you go to the dentist, you're going to get your teeth x-rayed, the dental technician comes out with what in her hand? A big lead apron. And she throws it where? on your lap. She covers your abdomen and your groin. Why? Because nobody wants their gonads irradiated. on that. Nobody wants that. And so we want to prevent mutations. Okay, natural selection. And I had this short phrase up there, show me the selector. That's an easy way to get around to show that natural selection is really just a metaphor. It's just a mental construct. It's only happening in your mind, but it's not really happening out there on that. And so when someone says natural selection did it, natural selection, usually say, show me the selector. And they'll say, well, there really isn't a selector, it's just a metaphor. And you say, well, metaphors really can't design anything. Now, if someone wants to push back and say, ask you, why would you say scientifically that natural selection is only happening in someone's mind, but not out in nature? I mean, I observe that an organism lives and one dies. Of course, organisms live and die. Why should I call that nature selects? Why should I call that nature selects? Why can't I just call it life and death? And you reproduce and you don't reproduce. Why can't I just call it differential reproduction? Why can't I just call it for what it really is? Why do I have to ascribe some magical selective force to it? So when someone says to you, scientifically, you could ask these three questions. One, is there a scientific paper published anywhere on the planet which documents nature selecting? Two, there's another concept which goes hand in hand with natural selection. It's called selection pressures. Ever heard of selection pressures? They're supposedly environmental conditions which are doing what to the population? Pressuring them, driving them, moving them as if we're modeling clay. Well, I'm an engineer. Long before I went to med school, I know what pressures are. I can measure real pressures. I can get a pressure gauge. I'll ask my selectionist friends, show me a scientific paper which actually quantifies a selection pressure. That's tough, because there isn't one. And then third, if natural selection is really being observed, show me a scientific paper which identifies what is being selected. Is it the genes? Is it the individual? Is it the population? Is it the systems? Is it your gametes? You know who knows? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And then if I'm breeding dogs, and I want a docile dog, and suddenly you go from pointy ears like on a Doberman Pinscher or a fox, and suddenly I get docile dogs that have these long floppy ears. Was I selecting for floppy ears, or was I selecting for a docile trait? Or do they go hand in hand? And maybe there's other stuff that goes along with it. The point is this. Nobody, if it's real and you're observing it, you should be able to tell me what's being selected. If I make a real observable process, if you and I design a process, we know where the selection events happen. We know where the pressures are. We know what's being selected. But when it comes to natural selection, nobody can answer any of those questions. And these are objective questions. Just provide the papers. But it's not. Selection pressures exist in your mind. The selection event exists in your mind. What's being selected, nobody knows, so it just exists in your mind. So why not just call it life and death, differential reproduction? Why do I have to describe this magical selection event where I can supposedly project human-like qualities onto nature, which it doesn't have? Okay. We have a better explanation, and that is when we look at living things, they show the patterns and hallmarks of design. Everybody in the room knows those patterns, but it's hard sometimes to articulate them. So when you want to explain to your friends patterns of design, this is how I'd say to remember it. Picture yourself going out to your car, turning your car on, getting out of the car, opening the hood, popping the thing, opening the hood, and looking at the running engine. What are you seeing when you see a running engine? Are you seeing multiple parts working together for a purpose?
Yes.
Are you seeing precise fit and finish?
Yes.
Are you seeing precise timing? Are you seeing a specific order of assembly? Anybody put an engine together? You start with the crankshaft, put the rods on, all that kind of stuff. That's what you see when you see me. Multiple parts working together for a purpose, precise timing, order of assembly, and of course, immaculate fit and finish. That's what you, and that's not in your imagination. If you were to ask my wife, she would say she sees phenomenal fit and finish. She says, well, you got married when we were 18, your fit and finish has changed. On there. It's so complex that the probability of happening is essentially zero. Why do I say that? Because the probability of getting a single part is X. Getting 2 parts, maybe 2X. Getting 3 parts is not 3X. It starts to go up what? Astronomically. 4 parts working together, 5 parts working together, 6 parts working together. The probability starts to, that happening by chance goes boom, down. And when you get all those parts working together, and you can prove this mathematically. And then finally, all or nothing unity. Many systems in your body are set up so that unless you have all the right parts at the right place, at the right time, in the right amounts, nothing's going to work. Nothing's going to work. And my favorite one on this is reproduction. Everybody knows reproduction. You know, everybody's had sex ed, so you just have to say, dad's parts, mom's parts, baby's parts. They all have to work together. Right time, right amount, right everything, or you're not going to get it to work. And if things can't reproduce, then evolution comes to a screeching halt on there. And then finally, freedom found in creation science. I usually have about 5 of these points. There's more in the booklet, but I reduced them just for this talk. The freedom to follow the evidence wherever it leads. This is good. Because they say that, oh, you already have the answers in advance and you don't follow the evidence wherever it leads. No. I'm not worried about any scientific discovery overturning evidences of design. I'm quite confident that more discoveries are going to affirm design, not overturn design. But evolutionists don't have this. I have a couple of good quotes, but I just reduced it to one. Scott Todd, during the Kansas debates over creation evolution, he published this in Nature, and that's why it's so good. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. Okay, a couple thoughts on that. First of all, he's changed the definition of science, hasn't he? He's changed it from observation and testing to what? Naturalistic explanations. So he's already changed the definition of science. And that's how they do that. But does this even make sense? Even if all the data point to something, you reject it? That's crazy. What if all the data pointed to the fact that these beams would fail under a heavy snow load? Would you come here? No, you wouldn't. What if all the data pointed that you had a certain disease, and I'm your doctor, but I'm not going to treat that disease? Nobody in any other area functions like this. Freedom from magic words. And these are magical words, like arose, emerged, appeared, gave rise to, burst onto the sea, miracle of evolution. Every one of these I've pulled from scientific literature and more. They're magic because when you say something arose or emerged, you're jumping over a bunch of missing data to tell you how it arose, how it emerged, how did it burst onto the scene. I mean, all of those kinds of things. What I'd like to do, and I'm going to try to talk my ministry into doing this, is make something for the kids to recognize these words when they hear them on Nova or National Geographic. And I would love to bring back the little clicker. Now, older people in the room knows those things. That little piece of bent metal, Remember that? A little frog. Click, 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 click. But instead of printing it like a frog, print it up and put these words on that. Print the words on this little clicker. And then you give these to your kids on that, and you say, I want you to listen to Nova. And when you hear these words that are written on this thing, you click, 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 click on that. And you can do, smart kid versus dumb kid if you want. Anything like that, you can have a little competition. But that gets the kids what? Listening for the magic and clicking it and tuning into the magic. Something that's interactive that will make them really useful in that way. Okay. And then finally, freedom from religious views masquerading as science. Religious statements. Here's a good one. Carl Sagan. Cosmos is all that is, ever was, or ever will be. He begins it like that. And you know how many people just blow right past that? Don't give a second thought? Is that scientific or religious?
Religious.
Totally religious.
Yeah.
So don't argue with your friends. If Dr. Sagan was alive, as I said, I'd say very respectfully to him, respectfully, Dr. Sagan, what experiment did you do? And what paper did you publish it in where you demonstrated that the cosmos is all it is, ever was, or ever will be? That's how you cut to the chase, whether it's scientific, ask them for the experiment. Can you do an experiment to prove that? No. It would have no beginning and it would have what? No ending. So clearly Sagan can't prove this, therefore it's a religious statement. It's a religious statement. There's another one in there where it's from Scientific American, and Michael Shermer, who wrote the article, is quoting Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, and Shermer says, with all the authority of a scientist, Richard Dawkins says, the universe we observe has precisely the characteristics that we should expect if there is an underlying no good, no evil, no purpose, no plan, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. On there, well, you kind of can laugh at Dawkins for saying that, but I'd say, Dr. Dawkins, what experiment did you do that showed that there was no purpose, no good, no evil? I mean, how would you do an experiment on that? You can't. This is just Dawkins' religious statement, masquerading as science. And then here's a good one by Stephen Hawking. Obviously, this was taken before he passed away on that. Physicist Stephen Hawking says there is no heaven. Now, how many people listened to Stephen Hawking before he died? A lot. How many took him seriously? A lot. So when he comes out and says there is no heaven, people are like, wow, he's a really smart guy. He must know. Stephen Hawking, the world-renowned theoretical physicist, finds no room for heaven in what? His vision of the cosmos. The 69-year-old says, quote, there is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. And in the context of the article, your brain was the computer he's talking about. So when you die, your computer breaks down. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. So he's saying that you believe in heaven just because you're afraid to die. And therefore, this gives you some comfort that you're going to go to heaven on that. But this is where you can point out even smart guys like Stephen Hawking don't know what I'm talking about. So if Stephen Hawking were alive, you could say, Dr. Hawking, what experiment did you do and what paper did you publish in where you demonstrated there is no heaven? So think through the experiment. You have to be alive. And then what? You have to die. And you have to look over and say, what? No heaven. And then you have to come back. And then you can tell your friends, no heaven, I was there, I saw it on that.
That's
Yeah, that is impossible. You're right, you're homeschooled too. That is impossible on that. So this is a religious statement. However, I stop on Stephen Hawking because how many in this room wouldn't wish for a second chance to talk to Stephen Hawking? We all would. We'd all want to do this. And we could point out from this talk, which I just did on 5 minutes, why we are less than persuaded, even though we've been listening carefully. Unobserved important events, all the bad evidence that they give us for it, the fact that they don't follow the evidence wherever it leads, they invoke all of these magical words. all over the place. And then you have all these religious statements, and you could even say, Dr. Hawking, don't you realize that this is a religious statement? You know, you really can't prove that, can you, Dr. Hawking? And if he's honest enough, he would say you can't on there. And I would say, you know, maybe it's not a fairy story for someone who's afraid to die. Maybe you have a fairy story for someone who's afraid to be God. That's what maybe the fairy story is. So we have these 5 minutes with the Darwinist to talk with them. Well, thank you for letting me go a little extra on time. Now I'll turn it back over to Rob. Please sign up for Acts and Facts. Visit the book table. Say hi to my good wife. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess that about wraps it up. We could probably have time for 1 or 2 questions on this talk. Does anybody have a comment or question that you'd like to make on this talk? Okay. Yes.
Has no one like you ever asked such questions of someone like Dr. Dawkins?
On that? Probably, yes. The answer is, I haven't asked them on that, and I haven't had many interactions with anybody nearly as renowned as Hawking or Dawkins, but other creationists have.
And what has been their response?
Their response has been basically rejection. For instance, Carl Sagan was a friend of another creationist, Dr. Larry Vardaman. Dr. Vardaman knew Dr. Sagan, and he shared with them. He shared with them creation, but more importantly, he shared the gospel. And Dr. Sagan rejected.
So that's the real problem we face here. It's a Satan versus God issue. It's
That's right.
powers and principalities.
It is. It's demonic and it's a heart issue.
Yeah.
Okay, one more.
Years ago, Dr. Tisch primarily went around and debated creationists. And I think you made reference a bit ago to being up in the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and giving some. What kind of events like that is ICR in particular doing today?
Oh, we still do those events. We don't have nearly as many debates as we used to because you just don't get many evolutionists to debate creationists like in the olden days when they thought that we were just easy pickings on that. But we still do the events. In fact, in terms of events at colleges and universities, I'm the one from ICR that mainly goes. So just in the last several years, I've spoken at University of North Carolina, University of Tennessee, University of Alaska, Michigan Tech, UC Berkeley. I spoke right in the life sciences room in UC Berkeley. It packed out the entire place, and nobody heckled me. Amazingly. My wife can come up with some others. I spoke at what's the Colorado school in Fort Collins? I spoke at CSU. And then I've done several debates. I did a debate with a theistic evolutionist named Carl Giberson, and that's online. And then a year ago, January, it was my last big debate, I did a debate with a theistic evolutionist from a ministry, if you want to call it that, called BioLogos. I wouldn't even call it a ministry. And then one from Reasons to Believe, and me. So there was a BioLogos person, Reasons to Believe, Catherine Applegate, Fuzz Rana, and myself. And it was moderated by Sean McDowell. And that debate's on the internet. If you go to Sean McDowell's website, you can get a link to the debate that was at El Segundo Church on that. So we still do those debates when they come up. And when I go to universities and I speak, even if you don't do a debate, there's almost always a professor from the university or two who want to challenge you on things. And it's really a good ministry to go to those universities because their students are in the audience. And if nothing else, they want to see somebody who will come with credentials, who can take on their professors and stand up to them, and he can't give me a grade on there. And that's really encouraging to them. So we do those when we get invited.
Good.
Could we get the question from our camera girl?
Oh, the camera girl.
Certainly.
I've seen her one or two times.
I actually just have a comment to make. You know, isn't it because we've been listening carefully that we're less than convinced?
That is. That's why you say, I have been listening carefully, but I'm less than persuaded. I have been listening carefully, and I'm less than persuaded because.
I've been listening carefully.
That's right. But don't say that to your parents. Dad, I'm less than persuaded. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I give a round.